When a civilian enters any branch of the military, they go through a period of basic military training that's designed to change the way they think and act to turn them into a soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, or Coast Guardsman.
Hard work, hard work. Hard work, hard work. Hard work.
This is seen as an important time in the individual's life, critical for the proper transition from being someone not in the military to part of one of the greatest fighting forces on the planet.
Earn more pay. Hard work, hard work, do it every day. Hard work, get up out of 2:45. Hard work.
After a period of time in the military, however, there's little done in any branch of the service to help that service member transition their mindset to life as a veteran.
Hard work, that's what they say. Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work.
As we often say here in the Change Your POV podcast network, after one leaves the military, they're never going to be a civilian again. And they're no longer a service member. They're this entirely different third thing, a veteran, with all the experiences, knowledge, strengths, and challenges that go along with that word.
Hard work, manifest. Hard work, you gotta do it right. Hard work.
One of the most overlooked aspects of transition is a service member's mental health and wellness. If the veteran has their heart, mind, body, and spirit in the right place, and has a support network of family and friends to rely upon, then they're most likely going to have a successful transition. If those things are not in place, things can get challenging.
Hard work, in the early morning rain. Hard work, that's what they say.
I'm your host, Duane France, and I'm going to take you through a veteran mental health boot camp to give you some advanced training for your brain.
Fired up. Hard work, everybody on the plane. Hard work, sit 'em on down. Hard work.
These episodes will cover the many different aspects of veteran mental health that I, as both a combat veteran and a clinical mental health counselor, see, experience, and support veterans with daily.
Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work, hard work.
I'm going to be joined by both veterans and mental health professionals talking about what you need to know about the stigma against seeking support, the different areas we need to understand, and provide some resources for when you think you might need them.
That's what I say. Hard work, earn my pay. Hard work, do it every day.
Get up in the morning and out of the rack, because this is some information that could very well save your life. Welcome to Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp.
Another day to work. Hard work, that's what they say.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast. As you know, we've just finished. This is actually the last episode of the Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp. And this has been one heck of a project. We've got over 12 hours of talking about veteran mental health. And I really appreciate you sticking with us and going through the episodes. And if this is maybe, if you've only caught the last couple episodes, I really recommend that you go back and listen to the first episode, Headspace and Timing, episode 25. We kind of went through the introduction. You get a little bit of a story there that in my opinion, gives a good reason why we need to pay attention to this. And then kind of run through the episodes from there. But on this episode, this is really going to kind of wrap up the series, and I wanted to bring on one of the co-hosts of the Change Your POV podcast network, Bennett Tanton, really to kind of wrap it all up for us, maybe tie the room together a little bit, and kind of give his point of view on this series, because as many of you might know, or if you're listening to this, if you're just getting into this, Bennett actually works in this space with veterans on several different levels, both sort of as a day job and in his nonprofit work. He works with veterans, especially with mental health, a lot from a peer support standpoint. So Bennett, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Duane.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. And so there you go, man. That was 12 episodes.
That was 12 episodes.
A lot of
sure.
stuff.
Covered, I mean, you packed a lot in there. Seriously. And I like the fact that one of the coolest things is that you pulled from all aspects. So it wasn't, I mean, which is kind of the point, right? It's not just a singular issue where a lot of times you have folks that too often in our space, things that get, post-traumatic stress, TBI. Those are probably the two biggies that are always focused on, where a lot of the other stuff kind of falls by the wayside. Stuff like, and substance abuse too. Let's be honest. Substance abuse is huge when it comes to not just VA care, but, care for veterans across the board, especially after this, the last 15 years at war. Substance abuse has kind of gotten out of control in our community. But, the big things that sometimes aren't focused on as much that I like that kind of got touched on are like the family aspect, family systems and whatnot. And then something that's near and dear to my heart is the moral injury factor, which is starting to gain traction a little bit within the community, and other organizations are focusing a lot on the moral injury because it's one of those things that it spans across all of them: PTSD, TBI, substance abuse, those, you know what I mean? And then, and I really like the fact too that you touched on the whole point of finding that really one of the biggest keys of defeating all these issues, and not even defeating, it's regulating all these issues, is having guys and gals helping them find purpose and meaning in their life. Because that's really the key. And that's what a lot of us are lacking now. So,
yeah, and that's exactly what you just kind of ran through is when I talk to other, again, even mental health professionals that may not be familiar with veterans specifically, that's exactly the sort of the conversation that they have. Yeah, PTSD and TBI, that's the big one. Those are the two sides of the whole circle. And then they say, oh, yeah, okay, and there's substance abuse. I know that. That's sort of like that third, oh, by the way, I forgot there was this other thing. But then as we start talking, there's more and more about it. And everybody's like, oh, yeah, I forgot that, or I didn't realize that, or I didn't consider that kind of thing. A lot of this conceptualization, that wheel that I put together, it's not really separate and distinct. As you said, the moral injury piece is part of PTSD. Everything really kind of integrates in, but they're separate things. And a veteran looking at this or paying attention to this whole series can kind of say, you know what, maybe I thought it was PTSD, but it's actually sort of the emotional stuff. Or it may actually just be my needs fulfillment, and so it's something that a veteran can kind of go through and say, hey, it's... I thought it was. I thought the knock in the engine was. I was going to throw a rod, but it actually was something else. And now that I know what it is, I can deal with it. So, I really appreciate that you kind of pulled that out.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that I took away from the whole overarching 12 episodes, and this is just because of in my background and the way that I look at treatment for veterans, and I see it's encouraging because I see a lot of the movement towards this direction is this whole health kind of aspect, right? So yes, this series is mainly about like, what do we call it? Advanced training for your brain, boot camp, mental health boot camp. But along with that goes the whole biological side of the house, is that certain things within your body, meaning hormones and even cholesterol and things like that, that all affects your mental state, and how all those things kind of correlate together, and that there's this coming together finally, frankly. I mean, there's people that have been doing it for decades, but I think finally there's more, and especially the VA, which whether people want to like it, whether they like it or not, the VA is the blunt instrument that we're using to treat veterans. That's just how it is. It's never going to change, folks. So what's the best way that you can do that is become part of the solution, right? And help the VA and practitioners and everyone in that space move forward, right? So it's very encouraging to see this whole health kind of thing start to emerge and really take hold in the veteran community. And that's something that I took from this, is that, like Eddie's episode, just like really trying to find fulfillment in what you're doing, or find something that gives you fulfillment. And then the moral injury episode with what's his name?
Joe
Dr. Courier. Yeah, Dr. Courier. Get it on, that's stuff that needs to be really addressed. And it doesn't necessarily have to be done in traditional ways. There's other ways to do it. And I think the last thing that I've got to say on this part is that it shows that you can't put everything in a little box.
No, absolutely.
You know?
And you can't even put everything in a big box. I mean, that's
Right,
kind of
absolutely not.
I mean, because we just went through, 12 episodes talking about veteran mental health, and very much in a forced perspective that we didn't get into embodied cognition and things like that. Going back to episode 28 with Mary Catherine McDonald, we're going to have her back on the show, talking about the integration of yoga into veteran mental health and talking about wellness and things like that. In episode 29 with Dr. Kano, she and I have talked a lot about how movement, and we talk about all these, going out and climbing rocks and, kayaking and stuff like that. All that is beneficial. And even in this big 12-hour discussion that we had about mental health, there's still so much more. There's a lot that we didn't get into, and I'd like to talk about that.
Because it's almost impossible. It's hard.
Right.
It's really hard. I know for me, and I like Dr. Kano's. See, I always use that. I'm so used to at work calling everybody doctor. It's funny. Anyway, but she's a vet too, isn't she?
She is.
I think she's naval vet.
Yeah,
She
was a Navy vet.
So, it's always good to have those guys so her, and she's a psychologist, right? So,
yes.
I found that I always got more out of, especially like talk therapy with folks that got it. That's a simple thing. So anyway, I'm not saying that I'm kind of one of those veterans or that there are tons of clinical folks that are not veterans that are just great clinicians that do really good work for veterans. But I urge folks that if you're looking for a therapist to just, there's nothing wrong with saying this isn't a fit for me. You don't have to be an asshole about it either. You know what I mean? You don't have to be like, I just bring it up because I urge people that sometimes you just can't talk to people. But there is somebody out there that you can talk to. So don't get discouraged. Just move on to the next one until it's a fit.
Well, and I like how you said that you want to work with someone who got it, but not necessarily someone who's a veteran, right? Because non-veterans can get it. They're not going to get it 100%. But if I look back on the episodes, episode 27, Erin Fowler, she's not a veteran. She very clearly talks about that. We were talking about external barriers, that she wasn't a veteran. She didn't marry a veteran, but she took the time to get it. Neither Marissa Brandt or Mary Catherine McDonald, neither of them were veterans.
Right.
Dr. Kidd, and somebody and he is a VA psychologist working in the substance abuse field. Not a veteran, but he's been working with veterans longer than you and I have been in the military, right? And so
absolutely
he gets it. Katie Bars, not a veteran. Dr. Courier, not a veteran, but yet some of the guests like Aaron Smith, a former Marine. I think I gave you a shout out in that episode 32, it's not all Marines are knuckle dragging crayon eaters. This guy, he was a Marine, and now he's an assistant professor, and working specifically in mental health. Josh Krameyer, Dr. Weber, myself. So I think that we had a pretty good balance between those of us who were mental health professionals, who are mental health professionals, who were veterans, and those that aren't. And I think this is another thing that the series really brings about is you don't have to go to a veteran. You just have to find somebody who gets it, like you said.
Right. There was another Marine, David Smith, too, right?
Yeah, David was not he wasn't a mental health professional, but I wanted to bring David on just because I needed to get him on the show at some point. But David was actually one of the first ones that he and I talked about this conceptualization, and I ran through it. And it wasn't even a podcast thing. It was, I think I had listened to him on another podcast and reached out and kind of went through this with him. And I think I even mentioned it on his episode. He was one of the first ones to say, everybody had told me for so long that I had PTSD, and he's like, it never really fit. And he said that moral injury piece you talk about, that's what got it for me. He was like, that's what I need to understand more of. And he was like, why haven't we been talking about this? And so David really is a great example of somebody who overcome that internal stigma and just said, screw it. I'm not gonna sit here in my poopy drawers, so to speak. I'm gonna deal with it.
Right, for sure. I think one of the things too and this is something that I've been exposed to for a while. It's like the moral injury PTSD kind of go hand in hand, right? The one thing that I've been looking at, and really Jeff Adamek opened my eyes more to I don't have TBI, you know what I mean? And I don't know a lot of guys that do directly that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. So my eyes kind of got open more to the TBI once I really sat down and talked with him a lot. So I started researching, being a reconnaissance Marine, and just my whole life is spent collecting intel, frankly. So things like, I really started digging into this, and you know who Andrew Marr is?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The Warrior Angels Foundation.
Right.
They've got some stuff going on there that's pretty awesome. That's shown big stuff to work with TBI that isn't necessarily from a mental health perspective. It is, obviously, but you got to fix the biological part before you get into the mental health part. And those are things that I think need to be brought to the table, and maybe we can do an episode on it at some point. It's just things like that kind of change the way that you look at things a little bit, that this is bigger than just taking medications and talking and things like that. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, and this was, maybe I'm putting my foot in my mouth or writing a check that I may not be able to cash, but every one of these episodes could be a 5 or 10 part series in and of themselves.
I would agree.
We could, and when Blair and I in episode 29 talked about traumatic brain injury, she of course was one of 4 or 5 different mental health professionals that I know of to talk specifically about traumatic brain injury. And Andrew was one of the people that I was thinking of bringing on about that. But there are so many different aspects of just traumatic brain injury. One of the concerns, though, is people think that, well, this is we're so in love with our own solution. I know how to solve traumatic brain injury, so therefore everyone must have traumatic brain injury.
Right.
It's sort of the corollary to, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Yep. The corollary to that is, if you think that everything you see is a nail, the only tool you're going to use is a hammer. Even though you have all of these other tools.
Right.
If I just think that this is a nail or a screw or a staple, I'm just going to use the tool that... And so people say, oh, it must be blank, therefore I should use X. And that's not always true. And so the hyperbaric chamber, the HBOT stuff that Warrior Angels is doing, and a lot of the other biological and sort of neurofunctional interventions that they're using, it's great if the primary issue is traumatic brain injury.
Correct.
If that's the only thing that the veteran is experiencing, or even if that's the primary thing, and everything else, once I solve that, everything falls into place. But I'll tell you, and I think I've mentioned it a couple times through this episode, not all veterans that I work with as a mental health professional have PTSD. 100% of them have a challenge with the purpose and meaning that we talked about in episode 32.
Yes, for sure. So yeah, and it's a great point. And that's why, again, I think what this can do and what the lessons that we can take from things like this is that really the best way forward is you've got to look at the whole person. You can't just look at it as, all right, well, I'm going to put him in the PTSD box or there. And as you know, and as most people know, there's such a correlation between like TBI and PTSD is there's so much overlap. That symptoms from both can be confused with the others, right? And then you throw substance abuse on top of that, and moral injury, and just frankly, good old anxiety and depression. The waters get muddled really fast. They get really murky. So I think that one of the things that I like to see now is the research that's being done on the actually understanding the way that like hormones and your diet, all kinds of stuff. Just, you can't you can't fix everything with a hammer. You can't fix everything with a screwdriver or a drill or a saw. You need them all. You need that whole toolbox, or in this fashion, more like a tool shed, because there's a lot of shit out there, and everyone is also different, because what works for you, Duane, totally is different than what works for me. Like for me, like literally, I mean, there's so many different things. Like one of the things that I know that works for me amazingly is like CBD oil, right? Yeah. Amazing. But I know people doesn't touch them, doesn't do anything, frankly. And I have another thing that one of my things that my nonprofit does and is big with is flotation therapy.
Right.
For me and 3 or 4 other guys that I have a lot of contact with, it's like amazing. Right. But I've met other people that it's like one and done. They're like, I can't do this. Like, no way. It doesn't do anything. And hyperbaric and, talk therapy even, some people can, it's so, it's daunting. But it's one of those things that we can't stop doing. And you just kind of, especially if you're a veteran and you have issues, and when you have issues, it. You can deny it all you want. But at the end of the day, if you look inside, you're not the person that you used to be, and you never will be. But at least try to get help to get out there and, don't destroy your family. Don't destroy your own life. Don't end up in jail like millions of other veterans have done, just for dumb stuff. That stuff that we would never think about doing before we went to war. But now it's almost like you're part of your brain that, is shut off. So it's like, don't give up. Just, listen to things like what Duane has done here and get this out there and really try to help yourself, because you're the only one that's going to do it. No one else is going to hold your hand. You've got to do it. And so that's one of those big things I've got to, commend you, because this is a hell of a undertaking to put together and put out there, No,
I appreciate that. But then even as you were talking about how, how these things compound on top of each other, I've taken to explaining this as, if you look at this conceptualization, you can be on a continuum of functional or dysfunctional in each area, right? So, you could have a handle on the traumatic stress reaction, right? The full moon doesn't bother me much anymore. The loud noises, I've got a handle on that. Okay, yeah, I get a little bit of activation and then I back off of it. But if you look at each of these areas, and these are 8 different areas, and then we tacked on with Dr. Weber with medications at the end.
Right.
But each of these 8 areas is a potential fault line in the foundation of your house, right? And so if the only crack in your foundation is traumatic brain injury, well, we've got stuff that can fix that, and you can go ahead and build the house. But if you have traumatic brain injury and PTSD, and then substance abuse, and then you have this learned helplessness thing, and then you have the crack in your foundation that now your needs are frustrated because you don't know how to access what you need to even be successful. You don't have so all of a sudden you start seeing all of these cracks in your foundation start to emerge. The more areas of difficulty that a veteran has in these in this conceptualization, these episodes, the less likely they're going to have a successful transition. And I looked at it myself. that I had a very good family system. You know, I came back from, you know, all my deployments, and I didn't come home to an empty house. You know, my wife was still with me, my family was still with me. You know, and so where I may have a couple of areas here, but I found something after the military to give me purpose and meaning, and that's veteran mental health and working with veterans in this. So I don't have that cracking foundation. I figured out how to fulfill my needs. I didn't fall into the trap of substance abuse. I don't have a traumatic brain injury. And so I've had more of a successful transition that others who have more concerns in this area don't have. And so I think this, just being aware of that, is how many of blocks does this check off for a veteran is probably likely correlated to how successful their transition out of the military is.
Yeah, big time. So this segues into a great spot for me to ask you. One of the questions that I want to ask you is, so with this series, was there anything that you learned along the way while you made this series? I mean, like, you know, yeah, you might know stuff, but was there anything where you was like, that's new?
You know, that's pretty interesting. And I think that if you go back to listen to Blair's episode, Dr. Khanna's episode, back in episode 29, and this seems so simple, but it was sort of like, you know, those, what do you call them, the optical illusion, or you're trying to find the boat and all of a sudden it just
the mirage, right?
Yeah. That I think I didn't realize that when we talk about traumatic brain injury and we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, people think the word trauma and both of those mean the same thing, and they don't. Traumatic brain injury is a physical trauma to the brain, where trauma, the word trauma in post-traumatic stress disorder, is a psychological trauma. And so if we're treating a physical trauma, if you're trying to stop the bleeding, that's what a physical trauma to the body is, by asking them how they feel about it, it's the wrong application.
Right.
You know?
How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's
right.
And so that's the thing for me is we kind of just we just kind of speed through it and say PTSD, TBI, two sides to the same coin, when they're very, very distinct and they're very different. And so that was one thing for me that was that had some pretty good revelation. And I really, like you said, I think, and not to be disrespectful to any of my guests, but I think my personally favorite episode was Moral Injury with Dr. Currier. And just the research that he has done and that his team has done on moral injury, I definitely learned some stuff there, because, you know, he studies it, and he even after the episode, he provided me some more information, and there's some really good stuff coming out in the assessment of moral injury and the treatment of moral injury. And so I even learned things from that episode that I'm actually going to put in place with some of the veterans I work with. I think I already have, actually.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the best episodes for me too. But that's also one of those things that it's in my wheelhouse. I kind of focus on that a little bit, especially when I talk to veterans, because I think it's one of the most least understood areas within this whole context. And I don't think people actually take it seriously for what it is in moral injury. Here in Syracuse, where I live, we were lucky enough to have a group of veterans and non-veterans, but mainly like people in the psychology department at Syracuse University, and then a bunch of student veterans and outside folks. Like one of the folks is a licensed clinical psychologist, but he's a Vietnam vet. And they run this thing called the Moral Injury. The Moral Injury Foundation, or it's like
it's out of Syracuse. I mean, it's out of
Syracuse. Oh God, what the heck is it called? Yeah, see, I go to meetings and stuff with these people and everything, and I can't even remember the name of it. Great plug, Bennett. Good job. The Moral Injury, whatever it is, it's awesome. And it just shows you how it literally can, how the like things like the grief and stigma and how all that stuff just creeps its way in. And that's one of the reason I say that I focus on it is because it's one of my biggest issues as well, is moral injury.
So, and that was, again, one of the episodes. And this is something that I'm considering as we look forward into 2018, that I'm probably going to do a series, a shorter series on each of these topics and bring in different individuals. And I was going to, reach out to the Syracuse there and talk more in depth about each of these things. And it's just in greater awareness. And so I think that each of these can be kind of a starting point. Now, one question for you.
Yeah, it's the moral injury project. Sorry.
Yeah.
I remembered, yeah.
It's a delayed recall.
Yes.
But and I'll make sure that connection to them is in the show notes, definitely. But talking to Eddie, Eddie's been communicating with me. For those who are listening, Bennett's co-host and from the flagship show for the Change Your POV podcast network. Eddie said that he found that episode 33 with Joe Courier and the PTSD episode with Dr. Marissa Brandt and Mary Catherine McDonald. He found it much more technical. He was like, he's like a little too academic for him. That it was.
Yeah, him and I talked about that too.
Yeah, he said he thought it was probably better for mental health professionals than it was for veterans who were kind of interested. And I found that interesting. Did you pick up on that?
And that's one of the things is I guess we only know what we know. So it's one of those things is the space that I'm in, I'm exposed to a lot more of this. So things like the acronyms, it's just like a non-veteran looking at a veteran and the way that they talk is different. It's the same thing would happen with mental health. So unfortunately, I think sometimes we might need to bring and I'd be more than happy to help you with all this. And I know that you, love what you're doing here, but it's one of those things that it might be one of those signals to say, hey, maybe we need to delve into this a little bit more on like a 2 to 3 episode series and break it down Barney style, because there are Marines that are crayon eaters, not all of them, but there's some are. And there's plenty of Army, Air Force and Navy folks that, might like to chew on the crayon from time to time too. So, and I'm not saying Eddie's a crayon eater. He kind of is though, but haha. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is sometimes this might be the first exposure that they have to any of this stuff.
Right.
So, that can be overwhelming. They're like, wait a minute. Like, what did you just say? And what the hell does that mean? And, let me get on the Google machine and try and do some reading about this myself.
Or actually, let me not.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Let me just ignore it because I'm like overwhelmed. So it's one of those things that I guess it really, and you know what, Duane, as you know, you can't treat or satisfy everyone. So what it comes down to is that you can just do the best that you do. But for me, I thought it was great. That's just me though. And I've had contact with a few other people that are like, wow, man, that opened my eyes to some stuff. But then you also are going to run into the guys that are like, man, that was totally over my head. And I don't think it's over Eddie's head. I just think that it's one of those things that he's like, wow, that's a lot to process. So I think that's my take on it.
No, and I don't know that I sort of, I guess, thought that when I put this, all together. Of course, the bricklayer doesn't realize the scope of the work until he steps back and sort of looks at it, right? And it's a holy crap, this is a big house. Although the closer I got to putting this together, I was like, wow, this was a pretty big project. But like you said, we don't know what we don't know. And for me, it was all really great conversations. It was really, it was of course something that I'm interested in, something that I had some familiarity with. And I didn't realize that this would have been something that just kind of goes over people's heads. And so it was good. I mean, all feedback is good feedback if you take it the way,
absolutely,
the way you want to take it, not necessarily the way it's intended. And I will have to go back and listen to maybe those two episodes with a different ear,
Right.
And I think that's beneficial. I mean, a lot of this series I think can benefit from re-listening. Just like anything, Jeff and I recently recorded for the listeners our co-host Jeff Adamek, and he's doing a series, pretty big series on Band of Brothers, and he had me on for one of his episodes, and I even mentioned it in his episode or in our conversation was go back and watch that episode after you listen to our conversation. You're going to see it with new eyes.
For sure.
You're going to see different things. And so it leads to the richness of the experience. And so I'm actually going to go back and listen to probably all of the episodes, but those in specifically listening to where maybe we can take the next conversation about that. And throughout the year, maybe have Eddie come back and ask those questions that maybe some veterans might have. But I think that was a really good, some really good feedback I got from him.
Well, I think one of the biggest things that I'm going to take from this as well, and I already have, is that I've told many clinicians that I know to listen to this. So I think it bridges that gap between veterans and clinicians, that everybody can get something out of it. And I think as long as you can get that foothold in either population or any population, I think it's a good thing. And I think that's what this series can do. And if we've packaged it all kind of as one big thing, right? So being able to throw that grenade in there and get that foothold is a big deal. And I think that that's what this does very effectively, in my opinion. So like going forward, what do you expect to come out of this series now that it's done effectively with this episode?
Well, there's a couple of different things. Eddie and I have been talking about, we're going to try to package it in a couple of different ways. I recall driving from Fort Carson to Fort Polk, which was a horrible drive. The drive.
Holy hell, that's a long drive too.
Yeah, but driving from Fort Polk to Fort Carson was much better because I was leaving Fort Polk behind. But just I didn't know on my way there how horrible. And don't hate anybody who's been stationed at Fort Polk knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah, or been to JRTC.
I was but see, even JRTC, you don't get the full. Like you're only there for 45 days or 30 days.
Yeah, but it's still horrific. It's still horrific.
Yeah, I was like
living there. I can only imagine.
Oh, it was horrible. It's the difference between Lejeune and 29 Palms. I think for you Marines, it's crazy. But I drove there. And I think I drove straight, some 12 or 13 hours. And I was going back to Afghanistan. I think I listened to the military history of Afghanistan from Alexander the Great to the present day. And it was an audiobook. So I could see that this is something that if you're driving cross country, I once drove
How many hours is that audiobook?
It was actually, I think it was like 14 or 16.
Oh my God, that's a pretty good one.
It is. I mean, and it was, and again, it was like you said. You're always, as a recon Marine, you're always gathering intelligence. But that was good for me because I was working very closely on that deployment with local nationals, with host nation partners and things like that. So it was very helpful for me to understand the nuances of Afghanistan. I love Afghanistan. You can keep Iraq. You forget that, but I love Afghanistan. But I can see that this is going to be something that someone, we think back in the day where you could pop in an audio tape of like Zig Ziglar or something and just drive and listen to it. And so I think we're going to package it in such a way that it's going to be easily consumable, that you can do it, on a cross-country drive or something like that. But also, so you can kind of go back and sort of re-experience or re-consume it. So that's one of the things we're going to start doing, I think, in the next couple of weeks, figure out a way to kind of put it together. So it's on the changeyourpov.com, it's on veteranmentalhealth.com, and you can kind of go through it. But it's not an easy, consumable one after the other format. So that's one of the things we're looking at. The other thing I see going forward, and maybe even it's just a little bit of emerging this morning, is reaching out and using each episode, especially the core 8 episodes, as a starting point for further conversations. To have mini series, if that's a word, I don't care if it's not, but to have small, maybe 3 or 4 episode series throughout the year, this coming year, diving a little deeper on this kind of stuff. So I think that's somewhere that we're going to take this. And then there's things that we didn't talk about. So there's going to be, I think, a convergence point between, we're going to use this as something that we further discussions about this, but then there's discussions of things that we didn't talk about. And I think that I've already started to formulate some ideas of some series about it, to bring on a series of guests to have some conversations about aspects that we didn't discuss here.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, like I don't have a full-time job, right?
Right, exactly. It's just about doing what you can when you can, man. So
I'd like to touch on that. From your standpoint, what are we missing? What didn't we talk about? Because I have a couple of ideas that I deliberately stayed away from in this series, but I'd like to hear from you.
Well, I honestly think that it was pretty comprehensive. I mean, of course there's going to be little nuances, but I don't really see, is in my day-to-day work, that kind of thing. Of course there's things that you can't, that don't need to be. So I work mainly in the vocational space. Right. But I've done plenty of work with the homelessness side of veteran, which is a whole nother aspect. Now it's related to other things, and that sometimes the root cause is things like TBI, mental health, substance abuse, yada, yada, yada. Right. But then you roll into, with the homelessness issue, you roll into a whole nother litany of things that can happen to a vet as well. Right. And it's not something, that's one of those things, is could you have added something on that? Maybe, but I think it's better. Maybe it's hard to say. Could it have been done? Yes. Could it have not? I think it's just as good not. You know what I mean?
No, I do. And that's exactly, and we didn't prepare this ahead of time, folks. I mean, that was literally just off the top of Bennett's head, but that's exactly what I was talking about. Those resulting incidents or resulting effects of this, a lack of comprehension in sort of this mental health space. So there are things that veterans struggle with, that these 8 issues and then the medications on the end, that they're the basis of it, but there's the lagging indicators of the greater problem. And so, like you just said, the homelessness piece, the employment piece, I think we barely touched on veteran suicide, and we all know that this is a huge issue.
But the biggest, it's what right now, and this is just because of inside knowledge, that is right now the biggest push is on preventing and curbing veteran suicide at the VA. I can tell you that is the biggest talking point on a day-to-day basis. Unequivocally, how can we stop, or at least lessen the flood, frankly? But it's, again, God, it's like you could go down this rabbit hole hard, and
that's one of the series that I'm planning on. And actually, after I completed this, that's the next series I think I'm going to start putting together, and I'm not going to wait until the end of the year, Suicide Awareness Month, is to bring together experts in the mental health field that deal specifically with veteran suicide, using this series as a jumping off point. Because I see suicide, and I think I probably mentioned it in some of these episodes, and I every time I say this, I got to figure out a different way to say it, but it's the best metaphor that I know how to use. I am not trivializing suicide at all, but it's like a runny nose. That if I go into the doctor and I have this mucus coming out of my nose, the general practitioner needs to determine if it's allergies or if it's the flu, because whatever that symptom I'm expressing, they're going to treat the underlying cause in different ways. One can definitely be more fatal. And so if I am a clinician and a veteran comes in with suicidal ideation and I think it's PTSD, but it's actually coming from moral injury, that's a different way that I need to approach that suicidal ideation. Same thing as if the family systems are prominent, or if my needs fulfillment. If all I need to stop thinking about suicide is to find a house and find a job and be secure in my fulfilling my needs, then that's more what you're doing in the vocational space, in the homelessness space, and less than what I'm doing in the emotional regulation space. You see what I'm meaning?
Oh, I do. And unfortunately, though, there's not a magic bullet and
right.
or a pill that you can take that fixes everything. And this is why this whole thing is so overwhelming.
Right.
Because we could start talking about all this stuff and the correlation between that and this and the other thing and the stuff and you know what I mean? It gets crazy and it gets a little overwhelming. That's why at the end of the day, the biggest thing in my opinion, of course, this is my opinion, and what do we always say? Opinions are like what? Assholes, right? So everyone has one. But me, with literally like over a decade of time in this space, right, that I've seen, really what it comes down to, and this is something that the VA is starting to get, it's just education. Literally, and unfortunately, clinicians don't have time to educate themselves either.
Right.
Because of the stresses put on them. Like, people are like, oh, they should know all this stuff. Man, they have families, wives, bills. Their life is just like yours. They just happen to make their living as a psychologist or a mental health professional clinician, right? Half of them, their lives are just as tore up as yours, especially like me. Like, people look at me like, oh, well, he's got his shit together. I can tell you every day is a struggle. So
Sure.
With that being said, the big difference between me and a veteran that's not succeeding, quote unquote succeeding, is that I educate myself and I try new things. So you literally, if you want to, this is my biggest gripe with the veteran community, is a lot of veterans, and this isn't everything. Again, it's not a hammer I'm talking about here. You have to take responsibility for you and what goes into your body and what you know to do that's right for you. You're the only one that can do that. A doctor can shotgun blast your diagnosis all he wants and hit all these different things, but what if you took responsibility for that and helped your doctor figure it out? Because I've not met many doctors, even especially at the VA, that aren't open to alternatives, but they might not even know about them. So print out a thing at the library. And using internet as an excuse is not. Go to the library, get a thing, spend 10 cents on a copy and say, man, what do you think about this, doc? I've done it. The reason I did that, that's why I'm on CBD oil now, is because I actually read up on it and took it into the doc, and the doc was like, wow, this is pretty interesting. So it's a partnership. If you allow them to dictate to you, they will. But trust me, there's more doctors than not that they really want to help you. They're just as overwhelmed as you. They need help. So if you have time to do the education piece and help a doctor see things, or help a, whatever you want to call them, doc, clinician, whatever, see things, I think that you should. Don't be an asshole about it, but damn, this is your life we're talking about, right? Nobody else can fix it. So, they can help you, but ultimately you're responsible for it. It's just that whole piece. So really what I think all this boiled down, it really comes down to education and personal responsibility. And man, sometimes people need help with that, but you know what? That's where we get into like what I do, Duane, with peer support, is I can talk to guys and I can do things that clinicians can't.
Right.
Legally, morally, ethically, I can do things that you cannot. just as a standard of practice. So I can, you can do it, but I'm sure the overarching ethics of your licensure could be in dire, peril if you said certain things to freaking the wrong person, right?
Right, but even things like I don't have my clients' phone numbers, right? We don't communicate outside the therapeutic
right, because that's how
like that.
that's how it's set up, right?
Right.
So for me, a lot of the guys that I deal with, they're not my friends. I keep that professional distance, but if they need to talk, they're going to call me. And that's a monstrous responsibility. The problem that you've got with that is we need more guys in the peer support role, frankly. And if you've got your shit together and you seemingly can do this stuff, go out there and look at it as a mentoring opportunity, as a peer-to-peer thing, and just help guys and gals. If they just sometimes all they need to do is talk to somebody that's been in the same mud that they've been in. And
you're right. And what you're talking about is learning self-advocacy. And that's actually something that Dr. Weber and I talked about in episode 36 is the idea of, hey, and right or wrong. And I don't even know if veterans think that this is actually the case or not, or once they start to realize it, whether it's right. But people with college degrees were the superiors. That was the idea of, if you have a college degree, more likely than not, you're going to be an officer, a senior non-commissioned officer, and so I should listen to you. And then when they come in to a doc, they're like, well, you're the doc, you should know what's best for me, when it's not always the case. And so we have to learn how to advocate for ourselves to be able to say, I want this and not that, I'll go this far and no farther. And then the mental health professionals need to allow that advocacy to occur as well. And so, like you said, it is a partnership.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those aspects that you look at. Like, I use myself, obviously, because I know myself better than I know anybody, right? So I, at one point, and it wasn't my lowest point, but I was at a pretty bad spot where literally I was on, like, we bring up episode 36 with Dr. Weber, right, where we talk about medications. Medications have their place. They totally do. And some people can't function without them, right? But for me, like, at one point I was on like 8 different meds, and I know people that are on more.
Right.
And frankly, it wasn't helping. So you have to know when to pull that plug and be like, hey, doc, this isn't working, man. And most doctors will be like, okay, so what can we do? Right. So I gave my doctor options outside of the realm, because, again, right, Dr. Weber or you can look at it as psychiatrists wield the hammer, and their hammer is meds, right? That's their specialty. But most of them are really good at certain kinds of therapy too. And maybe there's alternative things. You just, again, the self-advocacy part is a huge piece. And sometimes you're not there. I get it. But that's why you have people like me and patient advocates at places. If you look for the help, it's there. Just don't get so discouraged. And so often I see guys and gals get so discouraged, and then they just end up in bad places. Use a little bit of that self-control that we did learn, and be like, listen, that discipline, pull it out of wherever you can, man. Because this is a fight. It's not something that just is going to fix itself. It's a fight. It's a struggle. Just like if your weapon went down, pick a freaking outpost in Afghanistan or Iraq. If your weapon went down and you're out of the fight, man, you're out of the fight. And you got to do everything you can to get back in the fight, because guess what, though? This fight, again, is your life. And if you ignore it, you're screwed. I mean, that's what it comes down to. So either you have to advocate, or you've got to find a spouse, a friend, somebody that can help you. Don't education, number one. Number two, you're not there. You're not in it alone. You're really not.
Yeah,
Find somebody to help you.
And that's, I think, one of the other things that have emerged from this, and it was sort of the intent from the beginning, was to I mean, this was a sampler menu, right? This was just, you go to Applebee's and you get the sampler platter or whatever it is. But this is Dr. Weber. Yeah, he's a board-certified psychiatrist, but he's not a guy that says meds are the answer to everything. He makes that very clear in his episode. That he was like, it is one part of the solution, and if there's one guy like Dr. Weber, there's more people out there like him. So find people like him,
right?
That you don't have to, and that's sort of what I wanted to do, was to be able to give veterans, and we're talking specifically veterans here, exposure to other mental health professionals who absolutely know what they're talking about, who are crushing it when it comes to their specific specialty, but they're not veterans themselves, and so they can go to Dr. Katie Bars. We talked about emotional regulation back in episode 31. And Dr. Bars and Dr. Cano know each other, and they have immense respect for each other. One's a veteran, one's not. You can choose which one to go to. I brought on academics, so not mental health professionals. Doctors Marissa Brandt, Mary Catherine McDonald were not practicing clinicians. All they do is research this stuff, but they have an immense amount of information. For the mental health professionals, there's veterans out there like David Smith and like Eddie who know about this kind of stuff and have the ability to use their voice. And so I really like how I was able to, this isn't me patting myself on the back, but again, stepping back and looking at the whole structure of it, to be able to say, yeah, there is potential here for things like that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So let me ask you, where do you think we should go? What's next?
No, I think that we should package this thing up and literally put it out there as a standalone kind of, lack of a better word, product or whatever. I think people need to hear it, if for nothing else, as a breaching charge to kind of open the door on stuff that maybe people aren't listening, and maybe they don't need all 12 episodes, but if they need one, it's good stuff. It's the way that I look at it. And I mean, this is kind of along with you doing, this is what I do, man. Along with a lot of other things, but what I do is I focus on helping veterans be as successful out of uniform as they were when they were in. That's what it comes down to. And helping people that really want to succeed. And this is just another tool in that tool belt, because Jesus, we all live inside our own little worlds, right? And the thing that regulates that is our mind. And if your mind's not straight, the rest of it's going to be kind of a nightmare too. So
absolutely. The 50 cal was rendered inoperable because of that little scrap of little bit of metal, right? And that's the whole premise behind the show, is that little piece of headspace and timing gauge is the thing that made the most destructive small weapon in the military's arsenal so effective.
Well, it's like you look at, you take like an elephant, for example. It's that, there's that tall tale where the mouse pulls or is it the mouse and the lion? Where the beast, whether it was an elephant or a lion, was basically made inoperable and just a cranky bastard and everything because he had a thorn in his paw that he couldn't get out, right? Or thorn in his foot, and that little thing made that big, awesome animal inoperable. It's the same kind of thing with us. I mean, literally take a look at everything in your life, from what you're putting into your body, your gut, your health in general. If you're eating McDonald's every day, probably not going to be at the top of your game, right? So it's a giant system. Your body is a system, and it's a lot bigger than just one piece. Not to bring, not to go off of the whole mind part, but it's all connected, right?
But it is.
So,
but it's not only what you put in your body, but it is what you put in your mind. It is what you put into your ears. It's what you put into your brain. Of course,
what you digest informationally,
right? Yeah, I mean, in that I think is a big issue. We're not coming up with the solutions here, folks. What the entire Change Your POV podcast is we're trying to point you in the right direction. So we're trying to help you say, you know what, if you need this, then go there. If you need that, then go here. That this is just information for you to use. And if you have the entire library at your disposal and you choose not to read the books, then really at a certain point, that's on you. For
sure. I agree.
So no, I appreciate you taking the time to wrap this up for me, man. This was a big project. I've got I'm satisfied, and yet strangely unsatisfied because, like you said, there's so much more that we can go from here.
Right.
But that's my piece. Any last thoughts?
I don't, man. I think I've kind of said it all. At least coming out of me,
Well, again, I appreciate you coming on, and we'll keep moving forward into the new year. And
sure, I love it.
And get some stuff done.
It's a freaking journey, folks, and we learn something new every day with it. And doing this type of work is pretty awesome, and just helping folks is good. It's kind of, I guess maybe I do have one last thing to say, and this is a blanket statement, but it comes from someplace that I know very intimately. And it's hard to be sad when you're doing good. Okay. When you're doing good things for people, it's hard to be sad. So if you can't seem to get yourself out of this funk that you're in or whatever, go find some people that need some help and give them a hand. Almost inevitably, you're going to pull out of it. That's what I had to do, and it worked fabulously. So hard to be sad when you're being useful. That's what it comes down to.
You're absolutely right. This was well over, I mean, this is probably, 20 something hours putting this thing together. And it was, again, not to be able to say, hey, look at me, but just to say, this was something that I felt was necessary, and I'm getting good feedback from it. But it's for you, it's for the veterans who may be struggling. It's for the veterans' families that maybe want to understand a little bit more, and it's for the providers in the community, clinicians and those like you, Bennett, that are working in sort of the veteran support space, that this is a gift, freely given, 100%, just to be able to try to help it out. And I think this is one of the things that, I'm a fan of Zig Ziglar, right? He was one of my original motivational kind of speaker people. And Zig was always somebody that said, as long as I can get you what you need, I'll get what I need. And so what is the needs of the person in front of me versus how do I satisfy my needs first? And so if we find a mutually beneficial a solution, then it's going to be, by definition, mutually beneficial. And that's exactly what you're talking about. If I help you get what you need, I'm satisfied and I'm not sad, like you said.
For sure. It's really that simple, man. It just comes down to finding your mission, and that's part of it. So,
well, I'm glad, and I really wanted to close with this. I really appreciate you and Eddie bringing me on and giving us this platform, and not just me, but on behalf of other mental health professionals. A lot of the mental health professionals that I have interviewed just in this series and so far, and even going forward, they're like, we're not doing enough to get the word out. And so for you and Eddie to graciously allow us to kind of come on board and put this together, it's huge. And so I want to thank you, and I've thanked Eddie for allowing me to be part of the Change Your POV podcast network.
Yeah, man, it's our pleasure. And you bring more to the table than than just that. And counsel and everything else. It's just amazing stuff. And it's a pleasure to have you as part of the family. So
absolutely. Well, there it is, folks. That is the end of the Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp. Hope you got your warm and fuzzies. And maybe like me, you both feel satisfied and strangely unsatisfied. And fire up the Google machine like Bennett says. We'd love to hear what you think. Reach out to us both at changeyourpov.com and veteranmentalhealth.com. You can find us. Bennett and I are both big guys in real life and on the web. So we're not hiding from you. So if you think that we got it right, let us know. If you think we got it wrong, let us know. Thanks.
Tell us how we can do it better.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bennett.
Anytime, brother.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created mini-me's. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
So there you have it, folks. Another episode of Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to changing your perspective on veteran mental health. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use the track Not Alone from his amazing album, Combat Medicine. Doc's a guy who's trying to bring the discussions about veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you need to check him out. Head over to therealdoctodd.com to purchase the album and support the cause. You're not alone, veterans. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created mini-me's. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please let me have strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life so demanding. So much pain on this planet. I hurt each time I wake, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. You're not alone.
Oh yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.